the Starfleet life with the USS Dauntless. Brave enough to be a Starfleet officer? Do you have what it takes?
Greetings. I am Admiral Swart, Commanding Officer of the USS Dauntless, and this is the briefing with the Admiral for Stardate -25-1542.1. I am the Admiral in question, and today we're going to be talking about exploration as a Starfleet value. But before we get into all of that, let's deal with the regular housekeeping. We record these sessions every Tuesday at 12:30 South African Standard Time. When I say every Tuesday, I mean most Tuesdays. You might have noticed that we've taken a bit of a hiatus over the last couple of months. That was not entirely intentional, but as we spoke about in a recent briefing, one has to manage one's priorities and deal with resources as they are available. And unfortunately, I had to reprioritize these briefings lower in my usual stack due to factors in my life that escalated beyond partially my control and partially in my control, but I had to readjust my priorities temporarily. But here we are back, and hopefully we'll be back to releasing these weekly again. So when that happens, it will be at 12:30 p.m. South African Standard Time, which is admittedly an awkward time. It's the middle of the day on a work day. So understandably, not a lot of people are necessarily going to be able to join us, and that's fine. If you can join us and you are an active duty member of the Dauntless crew, please join us in Discord, in the Dauntless Discord server, in the screening room channel, and you can join the live chat. It's typically pretty lively in addition to just being live. And you will also be able to then drop me questions or comments that I can address at the end. If you are not an active duty member of the Dauntless crew, you're welcome to join us on YouTube. We do try to stream this live to YouTube simultaneously, and there is a chat section on that page, which I'm told, thank you to Colonel Yubert, is currently working, although my monitoring setup is not registering it on my end. So hopefully if you comment on that side, I'll be able to see it this time. Otherwise, if not, I'll be able to come back to it afterwards and hopefully answer or address your question then. If you are in the live chat in the Dauntless Discord server, please make sure that you @tag me for any comments or questions that you need me to address during the Q&A section. There is often a lot of chatter in the chat, which is perfectly fine and acceptable, and the entire purpose of having a chat there to begin with. But not everything is necessarily for my attention. So if there's something you want me to see and you'd like me to address it during the course of the Q&A section at the end, then please make sure that you @tag me in it so that when I'm scrolling back up, it is highlighted for my attention, and that way I can make sure that I will see it. Otherwise, I'll be able to scroll back afterwards and address comments, questions, etc. After the fact by addressing you off camera. And the same goes for people who are not able to be here live. So you're welcome to drop a comment or a question anywhere where you might find this video. On YouTube, of course, the video will be available. One moment, please. Beg your pardon, dry throat. And also these videos are typically uploaded to Facebook. I know that Facebook has made some changes to their uploading platform recently, so it's possible we might not be able to upload there for very much longer, but I'm hoping that we'll at least be able to get this one up there and see how it goes. If I can, please feel free to drop comments or questions in the comment section there, and I will do my best to address those too. If you feel shy about posting your comment or question in an open thread, you're welcome to contact me directly, either Discord, Facebook Messenger, Telegram, smoke signals, whatever. As long as it's not WhatsApp, you won't find me there, but just about anywhere else, you can reach me and I will do my best to address your question, or hopefully even be inspired by your question or comment for a future episode of the Briefing with the Admiral series. So please feel free to reach out. That would be great. But who am I? Who are we? Why are we here? What's this all about? So the USS Dauntless is a future-focused action and advocacy group that takes a special interest in the Star Trek canon of feature films and television series. We draw inspiration from Star Trek and specifically Star Trek's depiction of an optimistic future for humankind, in which most, if not all, of the major problems that we face today, crime, poverty, disease, war, etc., have been largely, if not entirely, eradicated. And we think that that sounds like a pretty cool world to live in. So we would like to do what we can here and now to bring that world towards that optimistic future. And that is what we're all about. The Dauntless is a chapter of Starfleet, the International Star Trek Fan Association Incorporated, which is the largest organized fan community in the world for Star Trek, possibly for all fandoms. I actually don't have that statistic, but it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case too. And we are the chapter that is based in Cape Town, South Africa. Starfleet is a Starfleet style organization, which means that superficially, stylistically, we emulate the fictional Starfleet that exists within the Star Trek universe, the Star Trek fictional universe. When it comes down to our ranks, our naming conventions, our uniforms, even our chapters are referred to as starships, but that is metaphorical. They're not actual ships. They are our chapter structures are not ships, they are the crew, right? So the chapter is the ship is a metaphor for the ideological and doctrinal links that hold the crew together, right? And as I mentioned, we are one such chapter, and we are the one that is based in Cape Town, South Africa, but we are also online. Most of our activities happen on the internet, specifically on Discord, but in various other platforms too, which means that we can therefore have members from all over the place, and that is in fact the case. But before we wander too far off topic, let us get back to today's briefing, which is about the concept of exploration as a Starfleet value. But before we do that, one more aside, and I'm seeing that Curly Bear is asking me to show off our Lego Enterprise. So you may be aware that Lego have released their very first licensed Star Trek product, which is the Enterprise D. And of course, the Commander, Patterson, and I were on our phones ready to purchase them the second they became available on the local store. And so we did. There it is. It's above my head here. It's sitting on top of the shelf. It's a little bit out of frame. There you go. There you can see that's the Enterprise D. She also came with a Type 15 shuttle pod, which is on display elsewhere. But that was a great investment, we feel. We spent an entire weekend putting that together, and now we have a beautiful display piece that we can have in our home. If you are still able to obtain them, because my understanding is that they sold out worldwide pretty much the same afternoon that they were released, although I'm hearing stories about a secondary re-release or back order or something like that, so you may still be able to get your hands on one. I recommend doing so. Right, today's topic. Exploration as a Starfleet value. So first of all, why exploration? Why is that relevant? Why is that even part of the conversation? If you've watched very much Star Trek, you will know that the fictional Starfleet, which is the organization upon which the real Starfleet, Starfleet International, is based, inspired by, is an exploratory, diplomatic, and military organization, a wing of the government of the United Federation of Planets. Now, in this fictional universe, which is intended to be a depiction of a possible future of our world, right? It's not meant to be a distant galaxy far, far away. It's intended to be one possible way that our timeline could unfold over the next couple of centuries, and things could end up this way. And if it did end up that way, that would be pretty cool. That's the idea behind it. And so all of the things and people and organizations and structures and institutions within this fictional future world are grounded in our reality today. And Starfleet is no exception to that. So Starfleet is an institution or an agency of the United Federation of Planets, which is a multi-planetary governmental organization, something resembling a present-day federal republic, something like the United States, perhaps, or maybe something more like the European Union, or maybe a little bit between the two, where individual planets, worlds, colonies are largely self-governing, but they all have signed on to this United Federation of Planets treaty, which allows the Federation government to act as sort of an overarching interplanetary government and act on behalf of all of those different member worlds in various capacities. And one of the ways that the Federation is able to act on behalf of all those worlds is by providing this centralized service, which is Starfleet. Now, Starfleet wasn't invented by the Federation, at least not in this, again, this fictional future world. I'm going to stop saying fictional future world. We're going to pretend that it's real. We're going to do what we call a Watsonian analysis, or a Watsonian exercise, where we pretend that we are, for a moment, that we are inside this fictional Star Trek universe. And in this future, Starfleet is the outgrowth of various institutions that exists today. Now, if we look through the Star Trek timeline, and we go back to the earliest incarnation of that, which is Star Trek Enterprise, which is set in the mid-22nd century, roughly 130 odd years from today. Starfleet exists, but the Federation doesn't yet exist. Starfleet at that point in time is an agency that falls under the United Earth government. Now, although it's not explicitly stated on screen, we can infer based on a number of stylistic elements such as heraldry, mention, sort of vague references in dialogue, iconography depicted on the walls, things like that. We can piece together the history of what this organization was. Now, firstly, Starfleet is not an agency that reports directly to the United Earth government. Starfleet is a department or division of a parent organization called the UESPA, the United Earth Space Probe Agency. And we have an insignia for that. I probably should have prepared some of these diagrams and insignia, but I don't want to get lost in the weeds, so maybe it's for the best that we don't. The insignia for the UESPA bears a striking resemblance to the present-day insignia for the American National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, but with elements that are also in common with various other space agencies, specifically the European Space Agency, ESA, and one or two others that don't spring to mind. What this tells us is that the UESPA is a descendant organization of those present-day space agencies, NASA, ESA, the Chinese Space Agency, that one or both South African space agencies. We have two for some reason. I don't know why that's the case. All of these organizations that were separate governmental agencies of these countries that then later formed the United Earth global government, all of those agencies were merged together into one, the United Earth Space Probe Agency. The United Earth, by the way, seems to be, again, we're inferring based on a lot of stylistic elements, seems to be the next evolution of what we today would call the United Nations. At some point after the Third World War, which is set to take place in the next decade or so in the Star Trek timeline, at some point after that, the United Nations evolves into a new incarnation. Remember, the United Nations itself is the second incarnation of this idea that it is the descendant of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations became the United Nations, more or less, and then United Nations is set to then become this next thing, the United Earth, which is, again, some kind of federalized government, not unlike the United Nations or the European Union today. And then that will then evolve further into the United Federation of Planets later in the future. So United Earth has this agency, the United Earth Space Probe Agency, which is the 22nd century equivalent of NASA, ESA, and various other space agencies. And nestled within the UESPA is this organization called Starfleet. Now, what is that relationship with present-day institutions? So if we look at NASA, for example, NASA is a colossal organization that is, again, in the United States government, charged with exploration of space. Now, it is principally a scientific institution charged with space exploration, and it has two principal arms, as you would. One of which is deals with remote probes, so sending robots into space to explore on our behalf. That is run mainly out of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I now forget where that is. And then there is the Manned Spaceflight Program, which is the program about sending actual humans into space in order to do exploration that way. These two sort of separate legs of NASA, they collaborate on projects, but they're largely autonomous from each other. They share funding pools and they share scientific acumen and engineering prowess and that kind of thing. They'll even share launch vehicles, or at least they used to. But they have two separate missions. The unmanned space probes are there to explore, gain pictures, send back telemetry, return samples, and that kind of thing. And the manned program tends to be a lot slower because sending humans into space is a much more difficult prospect than sending robots. Is about getting actual humans to put their boots on the ground. So, of course, the manned spaceflight program to date has not gotten any further than the moon, whereas the robotic probes have gotten many orders of magnitude further than that because it's much easier and cheaper to send robots than it is entire people. Now, that manned spaceflight program centers around a core of people who are called astronauts. So these are people who are trained to go into space. They typically are recruited from either military or from civilian life, where they have exceptional qualifications. That I believe they need to have at least 2 degrees, one of which is in either science and engineering. They need to have all kinds of aeronautic experience. I know that the requirements aren't as strict as they used to be back in the Gemini and Apollo days, but they're still pretty strict. You have to be a pretty jacked individual in order to get into the astronaut program. Last time I checked, there was an astronaut core of 100 people at any one time. So there are 100 people working at NASA as astronauts, so people who could potentially go to space. Of those, most of them will never actually get to go into space. For any given mission that sends people up, the people are chosen from that astronaut pool based on their specific skills, requirements, and needs that as they relate to the mission that's being planned. So unfortunately, for most of those people, even though they are given the job title astronaut, they never actually go to space, unfortunately for them, but they need to be ready to go to space. And so they all are astronauts. That core, that group of people that are astronauts, the people who walk around in those blue jumpsuits with the big NASA logo on the sleeve, those are that group, that agency, that division, department, whatever you want to call it, that is what becomes Starfleet. And we can actually see, for example, we look at Star Trek Enterprise, the uniforms that they wear in that period are clearly derived from those NASA jumpsuits. Those blue jumpsuits, they look very similar in design. They've got different iconography, but they've still got the mission patches on the sleeve and that kind of thing. So we can see that lineage from NASA Astronaut Corps to Starfleet as a division of the United Earth Space Probe Agency. And then we project further into the future of the Star Trek universe. And at some point, the UESPA, the United Earth Space Probe Agency, falls away. And that entire Space Probe Agency is absorbed to Starfleet. Starfleet becomes the entire agency. So all of that is a way of saying that Starfleet's history is as the exploratory and scientific division of the United Federation of Planets, and before that, the United Earth government. There are 2 other mandates that the fictional Starfleet has. One is diplomatic, which is to assist in negotiating treaties and that kind of thing with alien worlds that are not yet part of the Federation. And the third function is a military one. On the occasion that the Federation needs to be defended from hostile alien species, Starfleet is the agency that is called upon to do that. Both of those come out of necessity, not out of original design. So Starfleet was originally intended as an exploratory service, and in order to do that, they needed to have a fleet of ships. And they quickly discovered that those ships came under attack from hostile aliens. And so those ships needed to be crewed by people that had the ability to negotiate in diplomatic settings in order to negotiate peace treaties with those hostile aliens, or alternatively, needed to be able to physically defend themselves with weapons. So Starfleet then had this fleet of ships that were out in space, that were capable of traveling at high speed. They were equipped for diplomatic functions, and they were equipped for military functions. It then no longer made sense for United Earth and later the Federation to have extra redundant space navies that then served also a military purpose. So although today the United States has both NASA and the Space Force, which is the Space Force is in itself an evolution of a division of the United States Air Force. It's only relatively recently been designated as its own branch of service. Those 2 agencies exist separate from one another. At some point in the future, Gene Roddenberry envisioned that those 2 things would be combined back into a single function again. So you would have one agency serving both functions, But generally speaking, the scientific and exploratory mandate would be the primary one, except during wartime. So that is why the fictional Starfleet has a scientific and exploratory mandate. That's why it's there. So from its inception, in other words, Starfleet's primary mandate has been exploration, scientific research, which is just another form of exploration, right? So physical exploration means to physically go to a place, to physically extend the boundaries, the frontiers of space and time. But scientific research also is a form of exploration whereby we extend the frontiers of knowledge. So we explore a conceptual space as opposed to a physical space. It's very much the same thing, right? It's very much the same kind of work. It's the same kind of expertise. You need the same kind of skills, the same kind of personality types, and the same kind of equipment to do both kinds of things. It's the same work. It's all about the expansion of knowledge, whether going to a place and looking at a thing, or whether looking at a microscope or through a telescope, or sending particles through a particle collider, that kind of thing. All of those are different ways of examining the universe, and therefore are all different incarnations of the enterprise of exploration. Right, so to sum up, Starfleet as an exploratory agency across all eras of Star Trek, from Enterprise all the way through the final seasons of Discovery, Starfleet has been dedicated to exploration and science. Those are the organizing principles of the fictional Starfleet. And it's even right there in the motto, to explore strange new worlds. It's not just rhetoric. It's not just a nice thing to say. It's literal policy. That is their actual function. So this is a reminder, not an argument. I'm not arguing a point here. I'm simply stating fact that this is what it looks like in Star Trek. Starfleet is the exploratory and scientific agency. But why? Why does that matter? Why do we need a scientific and exploratory agency in an institution like Starfleet? Why would we even build a thing like that? Now here we're getting to more argumentative territory as opposed to simply stating a fact. And this is where I argue, and I'm not alone in this argument, by the way, I didn't invent this. Exploration, pushing the frontiers of knowledge, the pursuing the horizons of what is known, is a fundamental human endeavor. It's part of the human experience. It's part of what has formed our species in the way it is. It's part of what separates us from our closest neighbors, is that desire to go to that horizon and see what's over there, to figure out what happens if I do this to that. What is the result? Pushing the frontiers of knowledge, whether it's physically by walking to the physical frontier or by performing experiment and seeing what happens. This is typical and, I wouldn't say unique, but specific to the human experience. It is intrinsic to human nature, and it is why we have the world that we have. It predates civilization, but it's also the bedrock upon which civilization was built. Nations, technology, all of that came from that proclivity to explore, to expand the frontiers of knowledge. And in fact, that is what Gene Roddenberry argues leads to the Star Trek future as well, is that continuing enterprise of expanding the limits of knowledge allows us to develop new technologies that take us even further to the stars. It allows us to develop understanding of other perspectives, other points of view that help us to solve those social problems that we have today. And it's that exploration of the physical space and the social space and the mental space and all of those different frontiers of knowledge and understanding that allows us to develop into that optimistic future version of humanity. But all of those drives, all of those motivations already exist within us now and have since the dawn of our species a million odd years ago. And we know this by looking at the distribution of people. So if we look back to prehistoric times, tens of thousands of years, right? So bearing in mind that something like agriculture is only about 15,000 years old, right? And we're looking now back 50, 60, 70,000 years. We're seeing people embarking on expeditions of exploration. So not just people who are wandering, tripping, getting lost, and then ending up outside of their homeland, right? So our species, as far as we can tell, evolved here on the African continent, here in Region 8, and then spread out from here throughout the world, right? And it looks like that wasn't an accident, right? It looks like there were deliberate expeditions of exploration that sent groups of people out beyond their established territory to go and see what was over that next horizon, see if maybe there was better hunting grounds, safer places to live, more interesting things going on, new prey, forms of shelter, and new forms of nuts and berries to pick, that kind of thing. All of that is exploration. All of that is pushing the frontiers. And when people got to the southern tip of what we now think of as the Asian continent, they didn't stop there, right? They built boats. They built little canoes that had outriggers to keep them steady, and they climbed into the ocean, this endless abyss of water, and they crossed that ocean from island to island, from continent to continent, and they settled on the land that they found on the other side, right? The people that we now today call the Australian Aborigines, they settled on that continent up to 70,000 years ago, right? That's 50 plus thousand years before agriculture was invented. They were sailing the oceans, looking only at the stars and feeling the ocean currents. They were crossing oceans and settling on the other side. This enterprise of exploration is intrinsic to who we are as people, right? It's just part of what we are and who we are. And the same is true of Pacific Islanders. Now, how do we know that they used the stars and ocean currents to navigate? Well, some of those people are still doing that today, right? Pacific Islanders are still using that same equipment and those same skills that they passed down for millennia to navigate. Now, admittedly, it's a dying art in the age of GPS, and it's now simply mainly kept up as sort of part of a cultural heritage as opposed to a practical necessity. But this is still a thing that is done today. There are people out in the world today that are able to navigate their outrigger canoes from one island to another, doing nothing but looking at the sky and feeling the waves. And again, it's not by accident. They weren't doing this by mistake. These were intentional acts of exploration. They didn't climb into these canoes by accident. They didn't fall into them, and they didn't cross the ocean by mistake. They set out deliberately to do that stuff. And more recently, as the closer we get to the present, the more of these expeditions have happened. I mean, during historical times, excuse me, there are plenty of examples during historical times of people doing exactly this kind of thing. So the Polynesian expansion, the Polynesian Islanders, they have oral history that describes their expansion to various islands in that region, sort of the Indian Ocean, the Southern Pacific. We have traditions and historical records of Viking exploration through the North Atlantic, even as far as the North American continent, and there's archaeological evidence to demonstrate that. When they arrived there, they found that there were already people who had gone there the other way around, right? People whose ancestors had circumnavigated the globe on foot by crossing the Bering Land Bridge and had already settled in that part of the world. We have Marco Polo, who also did a transcontinental exploratory expedition in order to find the other end of the spice route. Up until him, we didn't know of anybody who had traveled the entire length of the spice route, right? But it was his job to find out who was at the other end. It was a trade route where goods and information was being passed from hand to hand all over thousands of kilometers, but no individual people, as far as we knew, were making that entire journey. And it was Marco Polo's function to go and see what was at the other end. And he did. We have Magellan's circumnavigation. So he was an explorer who got in a ship and tried to sail around the world and succeeded. He did a very good job at that, right? Other great explorers, Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, those kinds of people who are celebrated today for having discovered various lands that were previously unknown to their European brethren. But of course, everywhere that they ended up, they found that there were already people living there. Because that exploratory impulse, that exploratory drive is so powerful that it had motivated multiple groups of people to go and seek out that horizon already. And they didn't have the ability to share that information with other groups of people yet. So Christopher Columbus didn't know that the Indians were already there. Vasco da Gama didn't know that the Arabs had already arrived in East Africa. And Bartholomew Diaz didn't know that they also were already living in the Eastern Cape. But that didn't dampen any of their enthusiasm to go exploring in those parts of the world. So these were all expressions of that same impulse. What's beyond that horizon? And here we talk again about scientific exploration as exploration, scientific enterprise, scientific experimentation. So science is the exploration of, I mean, it's not just limited to geography or surface of planet. It's the exploration of nature, of reality, the fabric of the universe itself. And it takes a number of forms, right? So anything can be considered a form of exploration, whether we're exploring biodiversity by documenting the number of species in your backyard, or you're exploring the universe by looking through your little telescope at night, or your very big telescope. If you're a professional astronomer, perhaps you're one of the astronomers working on the James Webb Astronomical Observatory. Or perhaps you're an amateur physicist who wants to test and see what happens when you drop a rock onto something else, right? Which many people have gone through a phase when they're little, of running those kinds of physical experiments. Or perhaps you're a professional physicist who likes to drop hadrons on each other at CERN. The impulse is the same. The only difference is the equipment. You're still exploring the bounds of the universe. You're exploring the frontiers of what is known about the world. Astronomy expands our view of the cosmos and understands where we are in the entire world itself. Biology uncovers the diversity and the history of life by looking at things like not only distribution of species where they are today, but also looking at things like DNA evidence to understand how all of life as we know it is related to each other. And physics is probing the very fabric and structure of reality and understanding how the world itself works, how it holds itself together, and how it creates a platform upon which all these other things can exist, whether that's stars or beetles. They all conform to the same laws of physics, and it's physicists who have chosen to study and explore that aspect of reality. So the common thread here is that humans explore not because it's easy. They explore because they have to, because they need it, because it's part of who we are. It's a fundamental drive to being a member of the human species. But how does that relate to us as Starfleet officers in the real Starfleet, right? So we draw inspiration from the fictional Starfleet in a lot of interesting ways. And I spend a lot of time in these briefings talking about how we emulate them in terms of their various values. But one of the core values that we haven't really talked about very much is this commitment to the enterprise of exploration. And I think that's just because I hadn't yet found a way of really framing it or thinking about it in terms of being a value that we hold as Starfleet officers. But I think I've settled on what that looks like now. And there are really two main ways that manifests. The first way is kind of an obvious practical way. And that is promoting and supporting scientific exploration and literacy. Right, so science communication is something that is easier and easier every day. Back in as recent as when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, science communication was relatively difficult, and it resided in the hands of people like Carl Sagan or Richard Feynman, who knew enough about science that they could understand it, and knew enough about communication that they could translate that into a language that people who were not inducted into the scientific ivory towers could understand it, right? If you've ever watched the original Cosmos series or read anything else really by Carl Sagan or Richard Feynman for that matter, then you know what I mean by that. These two men and others had a gift for translating very esoteric scientific concepts because, okay, so this is an important thing that's maybe worth considering. Over the last century and a half, science has, or the understanding of the world has developed from a place where it's kind of very commonplace. We can all kind of look around the world and understand how everything works, into a place where stuff that happens doesn't happen in an obvious way, right? When you're talking about things like subatomic particles, quantum physics, things happening on an astronomical scale, these concepts are not intuitive to people who are living here in this place and time at this size, at this scale, in a stable gravity well on a planet called Earth, right? A lot of those concepts are somewhat alien and obscure, and they sound a little bit like magic. And we everybody needs people who understand how these concepts work and know how to explain them in ways that we can process them with our middle brains. Middle is in, we're not microscopically small, but we're also not colossally large. We're kind of somewhere in the middle. We can understand with our middle brains more or less how these things work. And like I said, people like Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman were pretty much the only people that were able to do that back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Today, with access to the internet, that has exploded, right? Science communication is now something that just about anybody can do. Unfortunately, most of the people who are doing it are not doing it very well. So it becomes a challenge to try and figure out who's doing it well and who we should be paying attention to and who we should be disregarding. But we, as people who are committed to this enterprise of exploration and endorse exploration as a value, ought to be thinking about science communication as part of something we could or should be doing. Whether we're communicating the finding of science as we encounter them, sort of monitoring scientific publications or that kind of thing to see what's new and then telling people about it, that's one way of engaging in science communication. Another way that I think might be more useful or practical is to understand and communicate the concepts of science. And here I'm talking about methodological naturalism, which is the idea that through specific methodology that we call the scientific method, but it's a bit more general than that. Through specific methods, we can come to understand the physical nature of the world. Not necessarily understand it fully, but we can exclude explanations of how things might work as being wrong, right? We can narrow our understanding to things that are more and more correct. What do I mean by that? Something like, to say that the world is flat is wrong. To say that the world is a sphere is also wrong, but it's much closer to the truth to say that it's a sphere that it is a sphere than to say it is flat, right? The Earth is an oblate spheroid, which is kind of sort of like a sphere, and at a glance it kind of looks like a sphere, even though technically speaking it's not a sphere. So by developing our understanding through testing, through understanding how evidence works, how scientific finding works, how the scientific method works, by interrogating methodology of research that is being done and interrogating findings of things that we come across, in other words, becoming scientifically literate, we can learn to tell which things are probably nonsense versus which things are probably improving our perception of what's happening in reality. And that, in essence, is the practice of methodological naturalism. Naturalism is the process by which we come to understand the world, and methodology is the specific method, the scientific method, whereby we come to find those things. Now, that is what we call an epistemology. An epistemology is a system of knowing, a way through which knowledge is generated. And in fact, I would argue that there really is only one epistemology, and that is methodological naturalism. Now, there are other systems that claim to be epistemological, things like faith or remote perception or divine intervention or those kinds of things. I would argue that those things are wishful thinking at best, and they do not provide us with reliable insight into how the world works. Right? I'm not saying that you should pay no attention to those things, but in terms of finding out how the world itself works, those cannot be relied upon. They do not yield the results that are necessary. Right? You can't calibrate your GPS through prayer. You can't cure cancer by wishing for it, but you can do. You can hope or try or attempt to do either one of those things through methodological naturalism, through science, through coming to understand these things. And when I say understand these things, I mean understanding them in a real, repeatable, reliable way in which everybody can agree that this is how it's happening, right? That's what we're looking at. We're trying to get a grasp on objective reality that everybody can agree on, and that is no longer subject to subjective reality or perceptions of reality. So when it comes to scientific communication, science communication means in part helping people around you to understand the findings of science that might be confusing or exciting or interesting or new or misunderstood. But the best way, I think, to do that is by sharing the concept of methodological naturalism, why it works, why it's important, how it works, and helping people around you to become scientifically literate so that they can interrogate those things themselves without having to rely on you to interrogate things for them. Educating others formally and informally. So why are we doing this, right? So this is something that falls under the jurisdiction of the various science divisions of Starfleet. I mean, I'm talking about the real Starfleet here, right? So Starfleet International has an auxiliary organization called Starfleet Sciences. Starfleet has a number of these auxiliaries. These are kind of clubs within the club. They are special interest groups within the broader Starfleet structure, and Starfleet Sciences is one such group that takes an interest in science education. And we here in the Dauntless have a matching division called the Science Department, which is our research and education department. It's their function is to facilitate and guide members of the rest of the crew in their research and education. Now, that education could take, or typically does take, the form of helping crew members figure out how to use the Starfleet Academy, facilitating various different orientation or sign-offs to do specific tasks on board, creating educational programs for just day-to-day activities here in the Dauntless. But it also means facilitating exploration in the wider field of science. One of the things that we have done in the past and ought to still be doing is involvement in citizen science projects. So what is citizen science? This is when scientists, real scientists, practicing scientists, have problems that they are not able to process the data sufficiently on their own, and they need to farm out data processing to other people. A project we used to participate in is one called SETI at Home. SETI is a project called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is not a well-funded scientific endeavor. And this is a group of scientists, mostly astronomers, who have been for decades now searching the skies for any kind of signal that looks like it might be produced by an intelligence, by any kind of intelligence far away in space. And the way they do this is by combing through the data that all of the radio telescopes in the world are constantly scanning for. Sometimes that means buying or borrowing time on one of those telescopes that's not being used for a different project at the moment, or sometimes it means sifting through data that telescopes have picked up while they're doing other things, and looking for anything that looks like it might be artificially generated, based on a number of criteria that very clever people figure out. But that is a lot of data, and it all needs to be sifted through, and that's not something that one person or even one computer can do. It's just too much data. So what they used to do is there was a piece of software that you could download for free to your computer at home. It worked as a screensaver. So when your computer was not in use, when you weren't busy working with it, you would just leave it on, and this would pop up after a few minutes, and it would download a packet of that data from the SETI database, and then it would use your computer to process it, to look for those signals. When it was finished, it would send it back to the SETI server, download another packet, and work through it like that. And we had it had a little sort of social network components to the SETI at Home program, and we had our own little group there. We had a leaderboard and everything of Dauntless crew members who had contributed the most processing time to the SETI at Home project. SETI at Home project no longer exists. For whatever reason, they discontinued it a few years ago, but there are a number of other citizen science projects which we ought to be contributing to. Another one that I think we should probably be participating in is one called iNaturalist. This is an app that you download to your pad, and it allows you to catalog the biodiversity in your immediate vicinity. And the way you do that is if you see a living thing, any kind of living thing, you snap a photo of it and you upload it to the service. The service will use its AI to try to guess what the living thing might be, whether it's a plant or an animal or whatever it might be. It'll try to guess that and then post it for all the other users of the app to see. People who have a specific interest in that particular kind of living thing, whether again plants or animals or whatever, will be able to review your submission, and they can submit updated suggestions for whether or not the AI correctly identify that species. So they can say, oh, I recognize that kind of beetle. It's this kind of beetle. It's not that kind of beetle. And then maybe they can have a little bit of an argument back and forth, and people might disagree on exactly what kind of beetle it is. But eventually the community will reach a consensus. And once that has happened, it is confirmed that kind of beetle. So you can contribute in one of two different ways. You can either submit your own observations by uploading your images of life forms that you see in the world, or you can go through other people's submissions and you can opine. You can submit your opinions on whether or not that species identification is accurate, or both. There's nothing stopping you from doing both. We already have a Dauntless group on our naturalist, and I would love to see that expanded upon as part of our commitment to developing the scientific enterprise and expanding the horizons of knowledge. And that falls under the auspices of the science department. But there's another important way that I think that we should be thinking about exploration as a value of a Starfleet officer. And this relates to something that is part of our doctrine, our discipline here on the USS Dauntless, of mission readiness. Mission readiness is our commitment to self-improvement. And this is the insight that I only came to recently, which is why I'm only addressing this now. And that is that there is a frontier of knowledge that a lot of this discussion today has omitted, and that is the frontier of the self, right? We have our own world inside of ourselves, and that also needs exploring. And when I say world, I don't just mean one world, I mean worlds, right? We typically we categorize our mission readiness into three broad pillars: physical, mental, and emotional. And I'm always saying that those things are not really separate, but it is useful to think of them as being different. And each one of those is a world that can be explored. What do I mean by that? Here I'm talking a little bit more metaphorically, but it's still, I think it still accounts, right? In terms of your physical life, right? That is something that can be explored in terms of understanding what your limits are physically, your frontier, and then figuring out which parts of that frontier can be pushed further, expanding your capabilities over that horizon, learning more about yourself, learning that you could do things that you didn't think you could do before, doing things that you didn't know were possible. And the only way to do that is by engaging in mission readiness, which is to push your boundaries, get stronger, get fitter, get faster, improve your cardiovascular fitness, increase your muscle mass, run faster, run further, do more push-ups, lift heavier weight. That's how you expand your horizons. That's how you explore your physical world. And the same is true, possibly even more so, when it comes to your mental world, right? Learning new things, understanding new things. And this relates directly to the overall enterprise of exploration, right? It's about exploring your mental model of the world. Now, when we talk about exploring the world, we're not actually exploring the physical world. We might be, but really what we're doing is we are building a model of how the world works in our mind. And the more we explore, the more we learn, the more we study, the more we can expand that mental model to include new information about how things actually function. And that is the world inside. That is the mental world. And the more we learn, the more we study, the more skills we obtain, the more information we assimilate, the more that world can expand. And there's also the emotional side of things, the emotional world, and that can be things like recognizing your emotional limits as they are today, when it comes to things like especially anxiety or depression, understanding what those limits are, and then trying to push those limits further. What thing can I do today that makes me anxious, but I can do anyway? Even though I don't feel like getting out of bed today because I'm feeling depressed, what can I do anyway? Expanding those horizons, pushing those frontiers, and exploring the world of yourself, of your body, of your mind, and of your feelings. So to improve on any or all of these things, we ask, what am I capable of now? What lies beyond that boundary, right? What is it that I can do more than I'm doing now? It involves testing your limits, expanding your capabilities, and deliberately pushing your horizons outwards, making yourself bigger, making yourself more capable, and expanding that horizon of what it is that you can do in the world. Because this exploration is the same as any other kind of exploration. It just so happens that the frontier is inside you instead of outside you. So, in conclusion, exploration is a number of things. It's the fictional Starfleet's mandate. It's their function, their primary function. It's humanity's historical constant. It's something that has driven us to be what we are today. And it is a present-day ethical and practical responsibility to make sure that as many people around us as possible are as scientifically educated as possible. Whether we're exploring space or nature or knowledge or ourselves, the impulse is the same and the responsibility is shared by all of us. So, questions. Let's see. Colonel Hubert, I see we've got 1 or 2 questions. Do we know if all the Earth countries, nations are part of the United Earth in canon? I'm assuming they are because of the utopic nature of the Federation. Yes, good question. All right, so we do know that because we know that the very last country on Earth to join the United Earth was Australia. I don't know why it was Australia, but we are told that in canon. It was in a line of dialogue in The Next Generation. I forget which episode it was now. But we know that eventually all the countries on Earth joined the United Earth and that Australia was the last one. Okay, that was all the questions from the Colonel, but my yeoman submitted a few questions. Sure, there are a lot of questions here. I'm just gonna pick a couple. All right, let's look at this one. Isn't Starfleet basically a military organization? That's partially true, right? So as I mentioned, Starfleet performs a military function when called upon to do so because it has the necessary resources to do that. Starfleet vessels already need to defend themselves, sometimes physically, from potentially hostile aliens, because even though they're traveling out into space with the best of intentions, not everybody shares good intentions. And when they meet hostile aliens out in space, sometimes they need to defend themselves. So those ships are armed, they're fast, and there are a lot of them. Instead of building an entirely separate fleet of ships that are also armed, fast, and many of them, it makes sense to occasionally deploy that existing fleet for other functions that have that same mission profile, right? And that happens to be military. Now, we have seen that the United Earth government, for example, during the Enterprise era, the 2150s, had a separate organization called the MACOs, the Military Assault Command Operations. I think that's what it stands for. That was a separate military organization that existed under the United Earth government that was later absorbed into Starfleet. So they also had some of their own ships, at least one ship, presumably others. But it was redundant to have these two different institutions that had a virtually identical equipment profile. It made more sense for them to just be one organization with different mission profiles depending on the need. Now, we see at different times in Star Trek history, most of the time Starfleet is just straight up an exploratory service that provides some diplomatic services here or there. Especially when encountering new races, they need to negotiate those peace treaties and that kind of thing. But we also see times of conflict between the Federation and other hostile aliens. So we see the Klingon War in the 2250s. We see the Cardassian War, well, we don't actually see the Cardassian War, but we hear a lot about the Cardassian War in the mid-24th century. But then we see the Dominion War in the late 24th century, in which those Starfleet exploratory vessels are retasked to military function, and for a number of years Starfleet is then optimized for military purposes. So all the new ships that are built during those wartime years tend to have a more military focus to them, and then when the war is over, Starfleet then changes its shipbuilding priorities back towards peacetime exploration. And then you see things like the Galaxy class, which is this big comfortable luxury liner in space that also happens to be very well armed, but it's also very comfortable, so that this group of scientists can go do exploration when there isn't a war on, and they can even bring their families along. Okay. All right. Weren't early migrations just people following food, not exploring? I think that's a distinction without a difference. I'm not sure it really matters. Okay. So yes, I mean, we see other species that will migrate in search of food. But the thing about migratory species that are following food is that they typically return, right? So those migration patterns are usually seasonal because they know that the food exists here during this part of the year, and then they'd move to a different place in a different part of the year so that they can capitalize on the food source there. Then next year, next season, they go back to the first place. What we see in human migration patterns is not seasonal migration in that way. We see, at least over time, so over archaeological time, over thousands of years, a slow expansion out into all connected territories. Now, again, this is not unique, right? We see this in a number of other species. A species that I deal with and talk about a lot, of course, is cheetahs. And we saw a similar expansion of cheetah populations during the last ice age. So cheetahs evolved in what is today North America. And during the last glacial period, there was a land bridge that connected North America to Asia, and cheetahs spread along that land bridge and populated the whole of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And they were also still found in North and South America. So they were at that time the most widely dispersed predatory species in the world. There was a massive climate change event, and cheetahs went extinct virtually everywhere except for a small relic population here in Africa, which is why they are now found here and virtually nowhere else. They're spread out a little bit again from Africa, but that is why you find cheetahs in Africa today and not in North America. The same thing happened with various other species. I think horses also traveled back and forth. It's a whole thing. So there are other species that will expand into new territory. So it's not uniquely human, but humans do this in a way that other species simply can't, because we just have that extra capacity. And the best example, I think, of humans leading the charge or being the most exploratory out of all the other species is the ancestors of the Australian Aborigines and the Pacific Islanders, who deliberately built those canoes, those outrigger canoes, got into the ocean and then sailed across the seas, right? They sailed across seas not knowing that there was anything on the other end. Now, when Christopher Columbus sailed on his exploratory voyage, he knew that the earth was round, and he knew that he was going to find land. He didn't know that he was going to find a whole continent in the middle that he wasn't aware of, right? So he was surprised in finding the Americas, although he only made it to some islands. He didn't set foot on the actual American continent, but he found that cluster of land there without expecting to find it there. He thought that he was going to sail right across the Atlantic and end up in India, which is why it's called the Indies, and that's the whole thing. So he knew that he was going to find land, but those original hunter-gatherers who climbed into those outrigger canoes that eventually became the Australian Aborigines, they didn't know that there was anything on the other end, right? There was no land in sight. There was no island on the horizon. They climbed into those canoes and off into the sea, hoping that there would be something there. And there was. And it's that intrepidity that demonstrates that humans are uniquely brave and interested and courageous when it comes to exploration out of all of the other species on Earth. That we will take a leap of faith like that, trusting that we are so clever, that our canoes are so good that we can get into the ocean not knowing if there's anything on the other end, and just trust that we'll end up there. And of course, it doesn't always work out, right? Plenty of explorers, their names are not known to us because they never came back, right? We never found out what they discovered. And, tragic results ensue. The history records only the names of the ones that did make it back. But that in itself tells you about the danger of it, right? The risk involved in the exploratory enterprise. Why call science exploration? Isn't that stretching the term? I don't think it is. I think it's just a different version of the same impulse to understand what's happening in the world. It's about expanding the known into the unknown, right? Whether that's physically, geographically, or whether that is in terms of knowledge or understanding. And science, I would argue, does this more effectively than any other human activity, right? It's the most efficient system we have of coming to grips with the unknown or what we don't understand, of refining the limits of what is known and excluding things that we know to not be true. It's science in that way is simply the formalization of methodological naturalism as an epistemology. and that is how we come to know things. And that is simple. It's exploration. It's expanding the frontiers of knowledge. Telescopes, microscopes, equations, these are just different ships, right? Whether it's a wooden sailing ship or a telescope, we're still expanding the frontiers of knowledge. Questions about methodological naturalism. Are you saying that other ways of knowing are invalid? I would go further than that and to say that there are no other ways of knowing. There are other systems that think of themselves as epistemology, and I mentioned a few, and maybe I shouldn't mention them again, that think of themselves as ways of gaining knowledge or insight about the world, but those are illusory at best. You will find that none of those other epistemological systems produce results that are reliable, testable, and repeatable. The only game in town is methodological naturalism, which is science. It's the only real, reliable, repeatable way of narrowing our understanding of the universe. Those other systems are only useful insofar as they adopt the principles of methodological naturalism. And if they're doing that, then they're abandoning their own epistemology and they're using ours. So there is really only one game in town when it comes to epistemology. All right, question about mission readiness and self-exploration. What if someone doesn't want to push their limits? Okay, fair enough. That is a personal choice. But we are Starfleet officers, right? We are committed to a system of values in which this is part of our doctrine. This is part of our discipline, is to become better versions of ourselves so that we can perform better in missions in the future, right? That's the core of mission readiness. It's encouraged. It's not coerced. We're not going to make you do it, right? But readiness improves the individual and the team. And it not only makes you more efficient and more effective, it helps you to enjoy your life more, right? The more efficient your body works, the easier it is for you to do things. The more efficient your brain works, the easier it is for you to manage your subjective experience, to keep your emotions under control, to marshal your mental, emotional, and physical resources to direct to the things that you want to accomplish in life. It's not just for our benefit, it's for your benefit too. So if you don't want to, I guess that's fine. That's up to you. But then why? Why are you here? Right? We're a group that does this. All right. Okay. One more question from Colonel Hubert. I'd say that we're naturally inclined to scientific discovery if you look at how children learn about their environment as well. Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you. I mentioned that earlier, but I didn't expand on it very much. So when we're little, the way we explore the world is through experiment, right? When you're very little, like when you're a toddler, everything you do is an experiment. You're tasting things, you're touching things, you're throwing things, you're falling over, you're trying to get up, you're trying to climb over things to see how the world works, to see how physics work, to see how your body works, how solid things work, how liquid things work. Everything you do is an exploration. It's all research. It's all scientific exploration. It might not be very efficient because when you're that little, you can't absorb the body of work in which all of this research and all of this study has already been done. You simply can't understand it yet. Otherwise, we could probably save each other a lot of time if you could just read all the scientific literature, and maybe AI will help us with that in the future. But I think it's probably a necessary developmental step in that we come to understand methodological naturalism as being the only valid epistemology very, very young, because we actually are actively experimenting. We're running those tests in order to understand just how to move through our lives day to day, before we even get onto concepts of abstract physics or the universe or time or reality. Just understanding that if you sit on a chair, it's not going to fall out, it's not going to evaporate or whatever every time. You can sit on the chair and it's going to keep being there every time. Just understanding that kind of thing, that's epistemological naturalism. That's the essence of science. It's the essence of exploration, and it's how we come to be humans in the world. All right. That seems to be all. So I'm going to leave you with the following thought. Exploration is not a phase that humanity outgrows once the maps are filled in. It's a discipline that we either practice deliberately or we lose through neglect. To be Starfleet, whether that's the fictional Starfleet or the real Starfleet, is to choose curiosity over comfort, rigor over superstition, and growth over stagnation, again and again. Thank you. That is all for today. You are dismissed. Swart out.
The Starfleet life with the USS Dauntless. Are you brave enough to be a Starfleet officer? Do you have what it takes